The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Ferrari became the first top team to launch its 2024 car, which also took its first laps at Fiorano. But is this car going to be good enough to end its title drought? And just how large did Lewis Hamilton's signing for 2025 loom over proceedings at Maranello? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Ben Anderson and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, another day, another launch, Scott, so we'll get straight into it. Ferrari's generally flattered to deceive under these regulations with a car that's fast over a lap, doesn't win a lot of races. Any sign of that script being rewritten with the new Ferrari SF24?
Well, it's what's been outlined as one of the priorities for the car, hasn't it? They've talked about a big priority being the kind of drivability of the car and the fact that they want to make it a car that the drivers can tap into the potential of it on a more consistent basis over a race distance. That's where their argument for we can retain the goodness on Saturdays and improve things on Sundays come from, because the idea is that where it was held back on Sunday, I guess, was this instability that they dealt with at the rear for most of last year, and that tended to mean the car was moving around more, maybe overworking its tyres, and because it wasn't as fast, having to push harder to run at the pace that they needed to, which worked the tyres more, and you get trapped in this vicious cycle. The idea is this is a better car, it's a better platform, it's going to drive better, and everything will be improved from there. So, if all goes to plan, it's going to be absolutely brilliant, and it'll be brilliant for the next 2 years, because this will also be the basis for the 25 car.
And of course, things always go brilliantly to plan for Ferrari, don't they, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they always know exactly what they're doing. History tells us it's going to be plain sailing all the way to 2026. Well, we jest, obviously, but I think under Fred Vasseur, there's a bit more faith that Ferrari's more together and going in the right direction. I think if people are expecting this car to be a sort of wow potential Red Bull beater, they might be a bit disappointed. We were hearing at the end of 2023 talk of it being 95% new, and I don't doubt that they've overhauled most of the car and modified bits, but I don't think it's root and branch. It looks like they're evolving the direction they went in through last season, probably finishing off with the kind of Japan floor spec that helped Leclerc feel more comfortable. They were going to downwash side pods already, weren't they, from like mid-season last year. To me, they focused most of their effort on this rear end that Scott talked about. You know, they've created some floor area at the back, I think, with the side pod shape and also the gearbox. And I guess they're hoping that if they calm down the peakiness and the aero stalling there, the drivers are going to just unlock more performance. Whether that's enough peak performance to challenge Red Bull, I doubt it. But it sort of tallies with what Vasseur was saying from the middle of last year, that there's a lot for Ferrari to gain just from being more consistent, getting more out of itself, rather than chasing massive gains in lap time with kind of magic bullet solutions. And I feel like all the messaging around this launch is very much in line with what he was saying in the middle of last year. And Mission Ferrari for me is less about trying to topple Red Bull in the next 2 years and more about kind of building a foundation of a team to take a championship challenge in 2026. I think he's saying, look, let's not kind of chase our tails. Let's actually prove that we can maximise every race of every season, be operationally sharp, do the absolute best job we can, not leave points and tenths on the table that we could have done just relative to ourselves, and then have all the ingredients in place with Lewis Hamilton arriving and other key technical hires, etc., to really go for it in a couple of years' time. So I think it's a step forward car, but it's more kind of holding pattern stuff for Ferrari, really.
It's emphasising efficiency, which is what Fred does a lot. And actually, it goes back a lot further than the middle of last season. I think in Bahrain, certainly by Saudi Arabia. Ed, you'll probably remember this. We were hearing from Fred about how he would say things like he's never known a car that's so fast over one lap that means conceptually it can't be quick in a race and stuff like this. And for a long time, we were quite sceptical about that, and we kind of thought, is Fred's being a bit vague, and it doesn't really sound like Ferrari's going to get to the bottom of this. And he's talking about exploiting the potential, and there's a lot that we need to do here, and we'll find time just by doing everything better rather than by changing the car. And you kind of think, oh, well, you know, that's all well and good, but is it actually there? And obviously they did change the car. There were updates, but Fred was kind of proven correct through 2023 in that what they had, all the underlying stuff in the car that couldn't be changed, did have more potential in it. They had to change the aerodynamic surfaces and the way certain things worked. They had to try and tune some of those evil car characteristics a little bit. But the way they ended the season, especially given Red Bull didn't develop their car too much through the year, so Red Bull was a relatively consistent baseline, Ferrari did make their car better through the season. And that might sound easy, but it's very rare actually that Ferrari does that. It tends to get lost through a year of development. So I was encouraged by all of that, and that means you do give Vasseur and Ferrari a bit of the benefit of the doubt now going into this year. It's like, okay, well, if all these changes work, this is what you want to achieve, it should make sense. I have some doubts about a couple of elements that they've gone in, a couple of elements that they have on the car, whether or not the aerodynamics are kind of unique enough, innovative enough. It feels like they're just doing a very good Ferrari approximation of what Red Bull have done. And it concerns me, as I'm sure this podcast will go into with people who know more about it than I do, that they're the outlier now with the suspension at the rear. There's a reason all the other teams aren't doing that, and Ferrari's stuck with pull rod rather than push rod. But let's see, because there are elements of this car where if you take the performance potential of it last season, especially over one lap, and you tidy it up a little bit, you make it a little bit more forgiving on the rear, you make it a bit better at looking after its tyres, that is a pretty potent race car. So I think we can't write them off. And it sounds like they are gently more encouraged in reality versus when they ran the car for the first time last year, but they won't know that until they run the car on track again this year.
I think they're being deliberately more cautious, aren't they? Like last year, they did a much more razzmatazzy fanfare launch, you know, having that kind of big event and fans at the track and then seeing the car roll out for the first time. And there was a lot of hype around Ferrari, and they were convinced that they were going to be title contenders. Whereas this season has felt more like a reality check. It's like, yep, here's a quick rendered visual of the car, and now off we go and get on with the job. And I feel like that's very Fred Vasseur as well. He stripped things back and said, let's focus on the core racing priorities. Like he's a well-schooled racing guy, knows how to keep things simple. And I think Ferrari's probably needed a dose of that. And the car maybe reflects that. And of course, we should be fair and say this is the baseline for this year. So the key thing will be how they add to that and develop it through the year. If Cardile is right and it offers way more potential than their old concept and they can actually realise that, then yeah, maybe they can push on through the early races and through the development will close even further on Red Bull, give them a run for their money. But of course that's allowing for the fact that we haven't seen the RB20 yet and we don't know how much of a extra step that will take and how much more potential that has in it.
It's interesting because both drivers made a point about the change under the Vasseur leadership. They didn't make it emphatically so, but it was pretty much implied from the way they talked about him. Carlos Sainz said he likes the working methodology of this team over the past 6 months, the past 10 months, and that's what makes him confident in this car. Charles Leclerc talked about similar things. He said Vasseur gives very clear leadership, and I asked Leclerc about is it the fact that Fred couldn't really keep all those politics and those other factors at Maranello at bay and just let it focus on being a racing team. And he was keen not to compare it to previous regimes, but he did also then basically say, well, yeah, it is kind of that as well. So this is very much Operation Vasseur. And although, as Scott alluded to earlier, we were a bit sceptical, particularly when he was saying some of the stuff early on, which was partly what you said, Scott, there was more to come. And I think also partly it was just sort of being gently a little bit upbeat, just to let them quietly get on with things as well. So I think this is very much his vision of the team is starting to take, and I'm pleased he's been able to, because listeners to this podcast will remember I was a little bit worried that he might not be able to run this team the way he wanted to.
I think the drivers will be delighted, won't they? Because a lot of the messaging coming out of this launch is that their feedback has been basically the absolute epicenter of what Ferrari's done in terms of developing this car. I mean, it was quite clear that last year's car was quite evil to drive, and they spent a lot of time basically just trying to calm it down so that they could drive it more consistently. It sounds like they're aiming to take another big step in that direction. I think if you're Charles Leclerc or Carlos Sainz, you're going to be quite relieved if this car is going to be much calmer and easier to drive than its predecessor.
Let's just come back to what you were talking about, Scott, about the suspension, because that's a really interesting one, because Ferrari is looking increasingly isolated, not just in terms of that configuration, but also just in terms of the way they talk about the suspension side of things.
Yeah, there was an interview that Mark Hughes was part of last year in which Enrico Cardile said that suspension's a bit overrated, and his argument is that it's worse if you get it wrong then it's better if you get it right, if that makes sense. Like, you can do yourself more harm by getting the suspension and messing it up, but you can't gain that much out of it. So there's no point in pursuing it too much and putting it up on a pedestal, basically, which is essentially the opposite of what Adrian Newey says. And Adrian Newey has shown himself to have a pretty good grasp of the various sets of technical regulations over the years, including this one. And a lot of the other teams have gone in that direction since then and made it clear that it's not just about different suspension configurations just because they're a trend. It's because there are specific advantages. The push rod at the rear, it's all about opening that space, making it more aerodynamically friendly, letting the air flow more freely into that rear wing and diffuser area of the car. You can do a bit of slightly more neat gearbox packaging with that as well. And when we were looking at the Ferrari earlier and we were comparing the 23 and 24 rear suspension, that aero packaging thing, that even if you just look at because there are so few that have the pull rod at the rear now, it's harder to do this, so it stands out more when you look at it. When you're looking at where that pull rod is on the Ferrari, you see exactly what people mean when they say it's aerodynamically beneficial to have a push rod, because it's just in the way. It's so visible and it stands out so much more now because Ferrari's the only one doing it. Whereas when you look at the other cars, and you look at the Alpine, for example, which already had pushrod last year but have made a bigger effort with it this year and repositioned it slightly, you can see it's just so much more. It's so much neater. It's so much cleaner. And they, like I say, they've all done that for a reason. Cardile says that Ferrari have looked into it. They don't see the benefits, or they don't see enough of an advantage to offset what they perceive to be the compromises with things like weight and compliance. So they prefer to go down the path they know, because they like all the trade-offs that they're seeing performance-wise, aerodynamics-wise with the pull rod. But that says to me that either Ferrari knows something everybody else doesn't, and this will work or can work just as well or even better as the push rod, or a little bit like when Mercedes were pursuing different aerodynamic designs in the winter of 22-23, are you looking at the right stuff when you do these tests? Is the way you're testing this, is it robust enough? Does it go deep enough to actually understand the benefits of the system? That's what I'm worried about, that Ferrari is missing a trick, because if it is a problem, Ferrari have baked this into the car now for this year, and nobody else that they're fighting against, because Haas is the only other team that will have this, because they have to, because they take the Ferrari parts. they're going to be racing with a handicap versus everybody else if there is a fundamental difference in performance.
I think there's always an element of Ferrari liking to be different. They always like to plough their own furrow, don't they, and not seem like they're a team copying others. Maybe there's a snobbishness in there culturally, I don't know, in terms of approach to design. But I think also it speaks to what we said before about them feeling like they're in a fundamentally quite good place. Like they probably clearly believe they're the second fastest team, not as far off Red Bull as it looks because the car was just so difficult to drive last year. And I guess they feel like they can unlock way more just from doing some simple things to that and get much closer without having to kind of root and branch reform everything by changing some fundamental things, including the rear suspension. So they're like, yeah, it's a blockage, but let's just reprofile stuff to channel the air away from that rather than go, oh, actually, maybe we need to completely rethink this. And it could work, and they could suddenly, be on Red Bull's pace in qualifying at every track, and then suddenly actually they're better in the races because the car's easier to drive and we've got a proper fight on our hands. Or they could just be like Merck last year, and it's like, oh, actually, this concept isn't as good as we thought it was, and we're kind of stuck basically in the same position, having not made enough progress.
And it is important to remember it's difficult to tell with the suspension because you can see the external geometry. We've talked about the pull rod versus push rod. We can see they've got a little bit more anti-squat at the rear, a bit more anti-lift at the front, which is a general trend. But we can't see the...
Anti-dive at the front.
I should have said anti-dive. What words did I say?
Anti-lift.
Oh, brilliant. Anti-dive at the
It's
front.
a Renault Clio.
Yeah, anti-dive at the front. Yeah, that wouldn't help much more.
Look at me picking you up on technical terms.
It's much more your road car thing. Yeah, as I was saying to you earlier today, actually, I quite often say, think or type the opposite word to the one I mean, which is particularly problematic for a journalist. But anyway, to come back to that, what we can't see is the internal stuff. So there's kind of two things here. It could be that Ferrari's got some very clever internals that mean they can achieve everything that others are talking about with what they've got. Or it could be that they're missing a trick. So we don't really know. What we do also know is that there's never a magic bullet, though, is there? There's never one way of doing it. So it's possible that they could be okay. But I must admit, when you see a team that's basically in that minority, the only team that's made the choice to do it, as you say, has to have done it because they have to. Even Sauber, back in 22, they did their own gearbox casing, which allowed them to do their own geometry. They went straight to push rods. So that's interesting. They use Ferrari internals for the gearbox cassette, but then, their own casing. So it is interesting. They are very much standing alone on this now.
Yeah, at some point you have to kind of go with the crowd, don't you? There's just a fundamental reason why that's a good idea, and the fact that more people are moving in the opposite direction to Ferrari, or basically everyone is, because Haas just take what they get, would suggest that maybe Ferrari are missing something. When Scott mentioned the concern they had about compromising compliance, I mean, do we think the Ferrari rear suspension is particularly good on that? I mean, I felt like in 22 they were okay over the curbs and stuff, but I don't feel like they're really setting the trend in terms of low speed performance at the rear end. And obviously their tyre management is terrible, isn't it? So
I think they've got good ride quality though, because they've been very good on street tracks, haven't they? Especially short, sharp changes of direction,
that's true.
And being able to attack the curbs on stuff like that. They've been competitive in Monaco. Obviously didn't go great for them in the end last year, but then won in Singapore as well with Sainz. That's where they got their only victory of 23. So I think there are probably certain conditions in which it works very well, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the best platform. But I don't think they have a bad one. And I do wonder if it's, again, I draw another comparison to Mercedes. I do wonder a little bit if they see enough, or they think they see enough from what they're already got to think, actually, it's not worth us following the trend here. We can still do our own thing. And and there comes a point where you almost feel like, first of all, this is much more fundamental than the Merc side pods, for example, because this is something that helps with the car's attachment to the track and how it actually reacts to that, and it impacts all sorts of things from the aerodynamic performance at the rear of the car to what the car's actually doing when you're trying to brake, accelerate, go around corners. The side pod, to all intents and purposes, is glorified bodywork. And Ferrari is digging its heels in a bit and saying, we know best. And I just feel, even if you think it's negligible, it just concerns me. And like I've said for the third time, no one else thinks this is a negligible performance differentiator. In fact, Ed, going back to your Sauber point, James Key considers the pull rod push rod at the front a coin toss, I think is the phrase that he uses, but he says it's clear cut on the rear suspension.
Yeah, he says it's not a game changer at the rear, but there is a clear and relevant advantage to that. So that's the interesting thing. And obviously Ferrari can talk about what the compromises are. They can obviously invest effort they would put into that, into doing other things. So yeah, it's an interesting thing for Ferrari, and inevitably, because it's such a visually obvious point of difference, it will become something that people gravitate to when they're looking for reasons for if they're struggling. But then again, if they suddenly have a car that goes really well and starts beating Red Bull, you'd be saying, everybody should have gone to pull rod at the rear. Going to push rod was just following the trend. Foolish. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. But overall, yeah, Ben, it's an interesting sort of launch, wasn't it? Because it was quite lo-fi, but just an air of very quiet confidence. They seem fairly happy with where they are. I don't think they'll be fooling themselves into thinking they'll be beating Red Bull in the championship, grateful as they would be to be able to do so. So all about just another sensible step in the right direction, all building up to something, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a dose of humility is what they needed really after the 2023 launch. So this is much more sensible, a bit more focused on the important things. I think it's quite fun that they're an outlier in this one specific regard. If everyone was exactly the same, I think we'd find that quite dull. And I guess it just remains to be seen if Ferrari being an outlier means they're only good on some outlier tracks, which was kind of the trend last year a bit. Let's hope that, because to be fair to them, they have done some quite serious work in terms of working on the gearbox and making all of that bit of the car refined. So, maybe it all joins together into something quite potent and you have a nice kind of offset battle between what they're doing and what everyone else is doing.
We'll hear from Gary Anderson in detail on the car in a moment. But first, if you have any questions on any of the car launches we've seen so far or any that are upcoming this week, we'll be doing a special car launches Q&A podcast exclusively for members on Friday. If you'd like to ask a question and indeed listen to that podcast, you'll need to join the Race Members Club. And what better time to do it because we currently have an amazing offer. For a limited period, we're offering a 1-month free trial membership, meaning you can enjoy everything the Race Members Club has to offer. That includes exclusive members-only podcasts, early access to Bring Back V10's episodes, a reduced ad environment on the website, exclusive access to the race.com comments section, member discounts, and much more. So you get this before we take any money from you. After your free month, it'll cost just £2.99 a month to remain a member. So that's less than the cost of a cup of coffee. So what are you waiting for? Sign up today and enjoy a free month on us. You can find full details on how to join by clicking the link in the description to this episode.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Now, joining me as always to get into the technical detail of the Ferrari SF24 is former Jordan Jaguar and Stewart Technical Director Gary Anderson. Now, Ferrari has talked about how this is a brand new car, a new concept, but as you said in your excellent analysis of the car that's now available on our website,
there doesn't seem to be any major changes. So how worried are you about Ferrari?
Yeah, it's difficult to see anything on the car that's really a major step forward, I suppose you might call it. Some of the little bits and pieces obviously will be a step forwards for Ferrari, but, you know, they need to look at the big picture because nobody else is standing still. It's very difficult overall to see a major change in the car that I would say would add enough performance to it for it to be a Red Bull beater. You know, we've got to remember all these teams will be aiming to take a step forward. So just doing enough to sort of catch last year's car might not be enough for them. If you look at the front wing, again, it's the first thing that influences the airflow structure, and what happens behind that wing, it's what the rest of the car has to work with. And you know, there's no real concept changes there as such. And actually, you know, I look at it, the changes I see is a little bit of a negative. Last year they had the little turning vanes mounting the rear flap, which would give them a little bit more outwash. And they've gone this year for some reason. Perhaps the regulations tightened up a little bit. I know there was a little bit of controversy with them last year. People were pointing the finger at them. And again, the nose is a bit more bulbous, so it's less likely for the airflow to spill off the top surface and go around the sides of the nose, which is what you want. You might try and get the mass flow you can through between the wheel and the chassis to give the leading edge of the underfloor the maximum flow to help it produce downforce. So, yeah, as I say, nothing jumping out to me that says, wow, you know. But, you know, I love Ferrari. I think Ferrari are Formula One. I really would love to see them being at the front because it's great to see that happening. But I'm not quite seeing that at the moment.
I guess the obvious thing that will stand out to people is you can see they've gone a bit more Red Bull with the side pods, haven't they? The more aggressive undercuts. They've moved the lower side impact structure into the floor. So they've done all that kind of normal tidying up for the kind of default for these cars, haven't they?
Yes, I mean, you know, all the cars we've seen so far have gone that Red Bull radiator intake direction. I keep saying about the airflow spillage from the radiator blocking up and giving it somewhere to go that's not detrimental to the underfloor performance. You know, sometimes you have to get rid of waste air somewhere, and you don't want that to affect the other parts, which could be the downforce, which is along the edge of the underfloor and through that undercut. But again, whereas some of the other teams this year have gone to what you might call a more bulbous side pod, redirecting the airflow a bit harsher out from that undercut. Ferrari have sort of gone a bit more streamlined. So again, you know, I don't like the bulbous bit and trying to make the flow work aggressively because you've got something in the way of it. I do like trying to manage the airflow properly and doing something with it as far as convincing the airflow to do what you want, as opposed to sticking something in front of it and saying, hang on a minute, to stop here and turn right, please. So yes, that area is all quite neat and tidy. The intake, very different from, you know, what we've seen on some of the other cars, Aston Martin, for example, and Red Bull last year. I keep saying it's a bit more like a hole in the top surface, as opposed to a forward-facing duct. On the Ferrari, it's still definitely a forward-facing duct. And, you know, it's one of those sort of things they might need more cooling than the other engine people. The cooling package might not be as efficient or whatever. But on the way there, it's all about all those bits and pieces adding up. There's no one magic bullet. It's all about everything adding up. And although there's steps in the right direction, I'm not sure those steps have been taken, as I say, big enough steps. You know, the front suspension, again, is, as they themselves say, more of a carryover from last year, push-rod operated wishbone package. So there's nothing there that's going to jump out and say, you know, yep, we've got something good here. Yes, they may have more anti-dive on the suspension geometry, but it's not much. And it's not much different from what they had last year either.
It's very interesting because suspension-wise, particularly with the rear suspension, the consensus among teams seems to be that having a pushrod configuration at the rear is better for the aerodynamic opportunity. In fact, Ferrari is now effectively the only one going that way. Haas has as well, but Haas have to take what Ferrari supplies. Pretty much everyone else apart from that has gone to pushrods, we're assuming. Williams, well, because they take the Mercedes gearbox as well.
The front suspension, the pull rod versus push rod, is a bit more of a coin toss. It's not so significant. But is that worrying to you that everybody else seems to think there is a small but significant and clear advantage at the rear to going push rod, and Ferrari saying, no, this is fine?
Well, I think if we look at the cars closely, the every car in the pit lane is using a fairly bulbous engine cover over the top of the gearbox with the cooling moving upwards. You've got a cross-sectional area of the engine and the transmission inside of that bodywork, and to get the car to cool, you've got to have some sort of a hole through there, bigger than that cross-section for the bodywork. So instead of having, a wider bodywork sides down the sides of the gearbox or whatever, most people are moving that opening to let the hot air out up higher and having two sort of cannons as such, I suppose you might call it. And when you're doing that, the reason you're doing it is because up there it doesn't matter too much, but down low it does matter. And you want to try and get the diffuser, the coke bottle area, the gearbox, the bell housing onto the back of the engine, all as neat and tidy and narrow as possible, because the overall width of the diffuser is controlled in the regulations, but the bit in the middle, the bolt shape in the middle, isn't controlled by the regulations. So the tighter you can make that, the bigger the diffuser will be. But you have to work at it from the inside. So having the pull rod suspension down in there, no matter what magic you've used, and Ferrari, obviously they say they've changed their concept of how they work the suspension inside the gearbox. That's good. Maybe they've got some minuscule thing that's generating the rear suspension for them, and I'm sure their engineers have come up with some trick. But still, you've got this opening up top where you can actually do something. It's the centre of the gearbox at the top of the bell housing is all hidden in there behind, the engine and the turbo and the plenum and all that sort of stuff. So it's not as though you're causing a great blockage by putting dampers and torsion springs and rockers and stuff on top of the gearbox. Yeah, the centre of gravity is going up a little bit, but it's still the compromise is that you have to give aerodynamics the leading hand. It's going to be the important thing whenever it comes to the out-and-out performance of the car. So by not going the right route could end up sort of stalling your development program through the season. And as I say, I'm not critical of Ferrari by any means. I'm sure they've made a better car than they had last year, but I just don't see that step that's going to take them up there. And if Red Bull make a little bit of a step to catch Red Bull and be competitive consistently.
It's worth briefly mentioning another detail that people will see at the rear of the halo mounting. There's a kind of just beyond vertical piece of bodywork coming from the halo fairing down to the sort of shoulder just behind the drivers. Obviously only a small detail really, even though it's quite visibly obvious. What's that all about?
Well, if you look at the front of that area, there's the section of the headrest, and then there's also the chassis that has to support the headrest. And if you add that all up together, you've got quite a sort of bluff frontal area on it. And basically that flow has to go somewhere. I mean, some of it will generate turbulence for the driver's head going inboard. There's fillet rods and all that on all those corners, and it's blend it in as best you can. But the way the headrest is and the position of the headrest, you have to have a certain thickness. So everybody has to have it. So it's a bluff sort of area. Now, Ferrari, in the past, last year as well, they ran a sort of duct there, an exit duct from somewhere. I'm not quite sure where the exit duct gets fed from, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was just a small cooling duct, because the cooling ducts are limited in these cars. That's why we see so many louvers on the engine covers. You can't just have a big hole anymore like we used to have in years gone by. So there's a width inboard there on the sides of the chassis where you can have louvers or holes to cool stuff. And Ferrari have used that for a hole. Now, whether it's just a duct or whether there's something in that duct between the inlet and the exit that's being cooled on the way, some people have said it's a magic S duct, which we used to see in the noses, which the S duct really worked from connecting up the bottom of the nose to the top of the nose, pulling more airflow through underneath the front of the car. And that's still quite important, but it's been done away with now. You can't do it. But if you can generate one some other way within the regulations, then fine. And Ferrari have had that a couple of years now. They've got a sort of vertical, I don't know what you like to call it, boomerang shape thin on the outside of it. And I think that, again, is to tidy up the flow, that bluff flow off the headrest area, to try to make it, manage that flow better so that the duct works more efficiently. And it's all part of the same package. All these little bits and pieces appear, but there is none of them being the magic bullet. They're all small steps, and obviously if you have enough of them in the right direction, then it can take you forward. But they're all small steps. They all cost time in the wind tunnel. They all cost money to manufacture, and they all add weight. So you've got to be careful that you're actually getting something from these things at the end of the day. It's I think it's a neat, tidy car. I quite like the car, but I just to say I'm just not seeing this step would be wow. I like that. It's really that's really important.
And just to finish off, let's try and give Ferrari fans some encouragement, because as you say, if you aggregate enough marginal gains and you get everything working well together, if they can eliminate some of that rear instability that they had, really build on the little bit of progress they made at the back end of last year, that could all coalesce into something that can do something about Red Bull, particularly if they can maintain the single lap pace while getting the race pace, which is something that they've really aimed to do. So if they've just done all this, no magic bullets, but just got everything right, got those compromises correct, and everything's just working as it should in terms of those subtle details, could that be enough to do something about Red Bull, do you think?
Yes, I think it can. It's all about adding up all the pieces, and there's a lot on the Ferrari that are neat, tidy, good pieces, genuinely good pieces. I'm just saying I don't see this sort of stamp that says, wow, we've really got a handle on it here. The thing they needed to do last year, we know that the car was quick in one lap. Charles Leclerc is one of those very quick drivers over one lap. But in the race, it couldn't really hang on, and it didn't really have a straight line speed with the DRS to be able to overtake. You got two situations in Formula One. You've either got to be able to be in pole position and disappear into the distance, or you've got to have a car that's got good efficiency, straight line speed, and looks after the tyres well so that you can pass other cars. I think, last year I kept saying about the triple DRS effect of having the beam wing and the diffuser and the top wing working together. Ferrari they've gone to that now. I think they played a bit with it last year, but they never really got on top of it as well as they should have done. But, you can see them now looking at the rear of the car, they've got this very aggressive beam wing element that helps work the diffuser, and then they've got a sort of turning vane they use using the other part of the beam wing. You have to have one beam wing at least, or one beam wing element, and a maximum of two beam wing elements, and there's a box that you can put them in, and how you configure that's up to you. Red Bull were the first team to show that you could use this, and it would actually be very beneficial as far as straight line speed was concerned when the DRS was open. So if you got behind somebody, you could overtake them. It also means in qualifying you've got that extra straight line speed during qualifying. But it does mean that if you get out the front, you've got the downforce to disappear into the distance. So you need to have that compromise. And the thing I say, Ferrari have joined that club as far as that's concerned. So I see what I'm seeing at the moment, I think might just be a better race car for them. I don't see the negatives in qualifying, but I don't really see that many, as I say, overall positives. But relatively, I think the race pace should be more in line with their qualifying pace, and that will be a bit more of a headache for Red Bull.
So gentle approval, but nothing to get too excited about. As always, thanks very much, Gary, and we'll hear from you tomorrow about McLaren and Mercedes.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Scott, for the first time, Fred Vasseur and the Ferrari drivers had to face the media properly since Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari in 2025 was announced. What were your major takeaways about what they said on this topic?
Unsurprisingly, they didn't want to say a lot. I think if they'd let it... I get the logic I do understand to a point, because there would have been a fear that it would become just a Hamilton question free for all, and it would have just been all focused on 2025. And with Carlos Sainz sat there at some point, it would have been unfair and awkward. All the launch stuff, he's in all of the material. They're preaching focus on 2024, and it would have just been, in their view, a bit inappropriate at times and a bit of a distraction to focus on something that's happening in 12 months' time when they've got a job to do this year and they've got another driver as the incumbent of that seat. So I totally get that. I feel that personally the best way of doing it, actually a good example of this was, remember when Red Bull got done for breaking the budget cap, and that was announced and officially over the Mexico weekend in 22. They put up a press conference for Christian Horner at just an undetermined length. It was basically just run until you're tired out. And I think that press conference went on for about 40 minutes. We got to the end and everyone, it was just out of questions. There was nothing more you could ask him. And so he didn't really get asked about it the rest of the weekend. There wasn't anything else to say. And that was actually quite a good strategy. And I feel like, in a way, Ferrari would have been better served at some point in the last week or two doing a specific thing on this and just getting it out of the way, because then the elephant's not in the room. It's been dealt with, or it's not something to worry about. And instead they tried to do it where they were like, okay, well, we don't want to talk about this. Please focus on the 24 car. Okay, you can ask like one or two questions. Then it got to Fred and it was like, oh, Fred will say something about it at the start, but then he won't take any more questions. And it's just a little bit, it's a different example of F1 being secretive or paranoid and doesn't really know why. And then it just creates more of an issue in its own right. So I don't think it needed to be handled in this way. And what they did say was basically nothing anyway. So they could have just batted this away with an open press conference at some point in the past where 10, 20 minute free for all, fill your boots, and then we move on.
Well, as Ferrari said to me on the day that the Lewis Hamilton news broke but hadn't broken yet, we don't comment on speculations. And I think that just kind of emphasises Ferrari's strategy sometimes. It's a bit
They don't comment on the real thing either, apparently.
No, exactly. They always seem to be a bit wary and needlessly wary. And I completely agree with you, Scott. I was going to say the same thing. They should have held some kind of proper press conference just to get it out of the way and not just kind of relied on a brief PR statement when the Lewis news came out, just saying, yeah, okay, you can't drop a bombshell.
We've addressed this. Yes,
exactly.
What do you mean?
We've addressed this.
Yeah.
with nothing but facts, or whatever they said in 2019 when the drivers drove into each other in Singapore, or was it earlier than that, 2017? 17. They can't drop a bombshell like that, Lewis Hamilton to Ferrari on F1 and the driver market, and then just go, that's it. No, we're not talking about it anymore until we've got a season ahead of us and we need to full focus on that. It's just not going to wash.
The funny thing was, Fred Vasseur said, we wanted to announce it before the season to get it out of the way, but they did that and then didn't do what you said and have a think. That they should have done something with Vasseur, just let him sit there, answer everyone's questions, and these things sort of burn themselves out, if you see what I mean. All it means is these questions will go on in Bahrain in testing. Now, personally, I wouldn't want it to overtake the launch completely, and that's why I'd quite like them to have done it separately, but I'm interested in the questions about the car, the development, that kind of thing. So it's not that we're obsessed purely with that story, but it is a big story, and it's difficult for them, I know that, but it just ended up being a little bit of a halfway house because it's such a significant deal.
What I find quite funny is that Ferrari was so determined to try to control this when they could have handled it a bit better, and they did it because they were worried about runaway questions derailing the focus of the launch event, and kind of mishandled it that way. But 24 hours prior, or just a little over 24 hours prior, Aston Martin launched their car, and in some calls that we were in with drivers and team people in anticipation of that launch, that we had some time with Fernando Alonso, whose media call about his team's launch was derailed by people asking him increasingly less relevant questions about Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari, to the point where Alonso got fed up and just said, I don't care about Lewis Hamilton or what he's doing. It's all words to that effect. And it was funny. I was just thinking of it when the Ferrari thing was happening today, and I was just thinking, in hindsight, and they couldn't have foreseen this, so I'm not blaming them. But it's ironic that it was another team that could have probably merited stepping in and saying, "Can we have no questions about Lewis Hamilton to Ferrari, please? It's nothing to do with us. You're derailing our launch."
But it's funny because we talked about this on the podcast yesterday. Mark Hughes went through it at length, but Alonso did want to throw out a few things about his future there and the implications of the Hamilton thing. But he answered some questions, and then, as you say, he then did one where he gave a very short answer, and it's like, right, I've said everything that there is to be said. And there isn't really much more you can do after that. So I quite like that approach. Now, to be fair to Ferrari, it's not like they were being massively belligerent about this. They said limit the questions, and even when a few people throw in questions after they've been asked not to, they were all right with it. They didn't clamp down. So it wasn't massively oppressive or anything, but it was just a little bit strange across the board, and maybe there was a better way to handle it. But again, it all points to the fact that we got the impression Ferrari didn't really plan to announce it with the timing that they intended originally. Otherwise, they might have been able to do it slightly differently. So there's going to be lots of questions about that in Bahrain. But yeah, it just created a little amusing subplot in this launch.
Well, I think the normal anticipated F1 strategy for something like this is to basically keep it a secret as long as you possibly can, and then it kind of leaks out gradually, and then eventually some point during the year you have to announce it and then address it. Presumably Ferrari wanted...
And it clearly leaked from the Italian side in some way, shape or form. The reason that is because Mercedes didn't really seem to know until pretty late on. So not even necessarily... I mean, I don't really know what other Italian side there could be, but it's not specifically Ferrari leaking like a sieve or whatever. But
isn't it
from that? It's clearly come from that area, that side of the deal anyway. Because I doubt if Hamilton leaked it himself.
Because what do you think of this? Okay, so eventually, you have to go with the tide and just get it out there and address it, and I think that's sensible. But now, effectively, you have this kind of holding patent season, where the whole narrative of Ferrari is, well, okay, they're just kind of waiting for 2025 when Lewis joins Leclerc in this kind of super team. So is that a good thing to just have out in the open and you can get on with it? Or actually, does it just distract everyone for the whole season until Lewis arrives?
I think it'd be all right. It was all right with Renault when Alonso was leaving for McLaren. I think it just becomes a fact of life not long after, doesn't it?
Well, ultimately, if he's going, and whether or not it's done pre-season or during the season, like at some point during the year it becomes a distraction, because at some point during the year those negotiations will happen, and if it's not confirmed and it's not announced, then you have an equally potentially destructive situation whereby drivers that are within your team don't know their future, and there's speculation about what you're going to do. Like, every scenario has ways in which you can paint it as, oh, this would be destabilizing, this would be this or that. I quite like the approach of, and this is where I had some sympathy with. I understand where the logic for Ferrari's coming from, is that I agree with the get it out there, don't let it distract. We've got a job to do. We've got to focus, because if they do everything that they think that they've done and they've set out to do for this year, they could be winning races this year, and in the absolute best case scenario could be fighting for a world championship or two. That's what they have to be focused on. And now, and by getting the news out there, yes, it's more than an open secret now. It's publicly confirmed. But you can deal with all of the stuff around that. You can make sure that Sainz feels as loved as you can feel when you're the one heading for the exit door at the end of the year. You can make sure that you pick your moments to talk about certain things, certain projects. You can be on top of narratives like, oh, when will you be able to work with Lewis? Or when will you stop Carlos being able to drive the 25 car in the sim? Will he ever drive the 25 car? That kind of stuff. You can control that all a lot more easily. I just think, so the logic behind it, where they're coming from, I agree with. Get it out there. Don't let it be a distraction. That's fine. But to not let it be a distraction, you also need to confront it early. And that's kind of what they haven't done. They've tried to have this, in this really roundabout way, tried to have their cake and eat it, in that, well, we don't want it to be a distraction, but our way of not letting it be a distraction is no one's ever allowed to talk about this, which is just silly and it's unrealistic.
I've got to hand it to Vasseur though, Ed. I think at the Christmas do that you went to, he was indicating they would have the driver situation sorted before the launch, certainly before Bahrain, and he definitely hit that target. So
he's a man of his word.
Exactly, yeah. He was just talking about something slightly different to what the rest of the world thought. But I think it's worth noting that the whole thing about distraction, I think it can be slightly overstated, actually, because generally speaking, teams and drivers are pretty professional. It's in the interest of the drivers to perform at their best. It's in the interest of the teams to perform at their best. The only thing where I think things really go wrong is if things get massively fractured, there's proper fallings out over it. Or if a team's struggling, a driver might check out a little bit as the season winds down. We have seen that in the past. But I don't think it's... I think people have this almost sort of soap opera-ish view of it, like everyone at Mercedes is going to be, Hamilton's off to Ferrari, or Sainz is going to be surly or whatever. But I don't think that's not how these people work. They're all really competitive professional people. And unless there's some monstrous explosion about it, I don't think it's going to be a problem. And that's going to continue to be a talking point, of course, over the year. But really, it's how well Ferrari will do that's the big question mark. And yeah, a solid step forward. Will it be enough? We shall find out in the coming season. So thanks very much to Ben and Scott. Head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen, loads to read there, including Gary Anderson's in-depth analysis of the car. Check out our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, the Race F1 Tech Show, our MotoGP, IndyCar and Formula E podcasts. And also check out our YouTube channel. A great video there on the Ferrari voiced by Scott. Well, we've got a big day coming up tomorrow with the new Mercedes and McLaren revealed, so stay with us for everything you need to know about F1 launch season.
The Athletic.